Now, I don't believe I was with you last week at the 11:30, but at the 9:30, I put forward that there's one theme, one takeaway for today. If any of you were at the 9:30 last week, what was that? Say it a little louder, just throw it out there. Pray the rosary every day. So to sum up all of last week, here it is. Let's say it together. Pray the rosary every day. Okay, so now we're going to dive into something very much related. Now, first I want to set up a little scenario. This summer, I heard some strange news that tragically a teenager died over at the Whitewater Center. They caught some very strange amoeba, Naegleria fowleri or whatever it's called. But basically you catch this thing, it goes in your nose in the water, and then it starts eating your brain. Within a few days you experience all the symptoms, a few days later you're dead. And up until recently there was a 100% mortality rate. Apparently in the United States in the last 50 years, 133 people have had it, all but 3 died. And those 3 received some form of experimental medication which has not yet been fully tested and approved. Now, let us suppose that we all went to the Whitewater Center or something after the Congress yesterday and found out today that we got it. Basically have a week to live. And this experimental medication, which has saved the only 3 lives thus far, happens to be down at the Mayo Clinic. Guess where we're going today? The Mayo Clinic, right? Who's going to linger for coffee and donuts before they go try and get the brain-eating amoeba taken out? I suspect not many. Point is that when you're seriously sick, you waste no time, right? You go and you find the cure if there is one to be found. And if you even suspect that there's something that could rescue you from something so serious, you're going to expend every effort and measure possible to make sure that you try and get it. It also happens that when we are seriously sick, who's usually the first one on the scene? Mama, right? If she's still around. God bless her. She's usually the first one to take care of us when we're sick, and seriously sick. So, the theme for today is, the world is seriously sick. Listen to your mama's recipe. So, let's try that one. The world is seriously sick. Listen to your mama's recipe. Okay. So basically, what I will say from here on out is rather a proof of something very sad. That the world is not only sick, but very sick. Mortally sick. Now, the silver lining will come at the end, because I suppose that the more serious, the more inescapable the disease or the condition, the more miraculous will seem the cure, should it come. And we'll also find that our mama happens to be on the spot here. But first, let us establish this point beyond any shadow of a doubt, just how sick the world is. How grave is this condition, and therefore what kind of effort we should be expending, especially if there is a cure somewhere to be found. So, rewinding the clock 99 years back to the apparitions of Fatima in 1917. This was near the end of the First World War. And being the First World War, it was something that had never been experienced before. Nothing of this magnitude, of this level of tragedy and suffering had afflicted mankind. When all the dust had settled, some 38 million people would be dead. And Our Lady had said to the visionaries, the children, that the war will soon end. And here is what man must do. And if he does it, then in place of such tragedies, there will be peace. There will be miraculous peace. But if not, even worse will follow. Well, we all know what followed when it comes to wars. The Second World War. And if 38 million were not horrendous enough, then somewhere between 50 and 80 million people were going to perish in that Second World War. And although, as the saying goes, that to the victories the right to construct the history books goes, nonetheless we can say that in such a devastating tragedy there are no winners. And by way of example, it was we, the United States of America, that dropped 2 atomic bombs on 2 densely populated cities and subsequently took the life of 250,000 people, most of whom were innocent men, women, and children. Put aside all tactics and strategy, at the end of the day, by natural law, it is absolutely inexcusable. It is a crime against God and against humanity and has been condemned by the church. And so everybody has some blood on their hands. There were no winners in that war. But being that that's now half a century ago, we'd like to think, well, thank God that's all over, that's all behind us, and that we live in better times. The statistics that I am about to cite, I think, prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that far from living in better times, we actually live in worse times, if that's even conceivable. Now, these are a lot of statistics, and you know the human mind really isn't good with numbers really big. Once you add enough zeros, it just doesn't compute anymore. So I'll do my best to make a few proportions or analogies to help us grasp the magnitude of some of these things. But in any case, I think in short order, we will get the point. After the conclusion of World War II, death did not cease or even diminish, but increased. And some of the more significant examples would be in communist Russia, at least 25 million people were to perish in the subsequent decades. In communist China, even more, 50 million, by political executions, and by exile, and by slave labor camps, and by famine which resulted from dictatorial policies. And lastly, a most uncomfortable statistic, and one we are not likely to hear cited in this country because it implicates us, is that in the course of the last 40-some-odd years, by the foreign interventions of the United States of America in about 37 different countries, setting aside for a moment that some of them may have been legitimate, nonetheless, on account of these dozens of foreign interventions over the course of decades, the United States has been responsible for the killing of up to 20 million people. Once again, there's nobody that doesn't have blood on their hands. And it has been an immensely, an unprecedentedly bloody century. Another statistic that we're less likely to hear in this country is one that is practically contemporary. In the last, let's say, 5 years, with the increase of violence and unrest in the Middle East, entire Catholic dioceses have been wiped off the face of the earth. Our brother and sister Catholics living in dioceses that have been around almost as long as Christianity, for almost 20 centuries, are simply gone, to be seen no more. Likewise, according to American history books, we like to mark it as a great accomplishment that we've moved beyond slavery, that's done. Thankfully, we've settled that issue. Well, quite to the contrary are these statistics, that in 350 years of the Atlantic slave trade, somewhere between 12 and 15 million people were shipped from Africa to the New World in North and South America. So to repeat that statistic, in 350 years, 12 to 15 million people were under horrendous conditions shipped over from Africa to the New World. At this very moment, according to the United Nations International Labor Organization, there is an estimated 21 million people living in slavery. By an even more incredible statistic, the Australia-based human rights group Walk Free Foundation has estimated that the number is actually 45.8 million. I don't know where you settle between those two polls, 21 and 45, but either of those numbers and anything in between vastly exceeds what happened in 3.5 centuries of the Atlantic slave trade. The world has not moved beyond slavery. And then perhaps the most telling statistic of all. There were traditionally numbered 4 sins which cried out to heaven for vengeance, for justice. One of those was the taking of innocent life. Who are the most innocent in the world? Those who have not even been born. Now, of those who have been knit together in their mother's womb, from all eternity known and loved and willed by God, in the last century, 2 billion of those have not seen the light of day. And by current estimates, 1/4 of all conceptions of those dearly precious and beloved souls to God are killed. Now, I said that we're not too good at crunching big numbers with lots of zeros. So 2 billion. First of all, that's about a third of the global population. But if even that is a little too hard to conceive, then if we had to signify that in the lives of Americans, then that would mean that every single person, man, woman, and child in the United States of America would be wiped out 6 times over. That's how many innocent babies have been lost in the last 100 years, basically since Fatima. Lastly, I would like to turn our attention to what happens in our own country. A lot of these statistics are never even brought up. And when they are, I think that collectively we kind of dull some of the sharp edges by thinking, well, we don't really have a lot to do with that. Yes, there are terrible things that happen in the world, but we here are not really responsible for all of those things. Once again, to the contrary, to take a cue from Our Lady of Fatima, she said that more souls are lost every day to eternal perdition on account of sins of the flesh. If that be true, then who is the worldwide leader? That would be us. By these statistics, that the combined action of US-based pharmaceutical companies, the increasingly tyrannical intervention of the federal and judiciary branches to make so-called reproductive rights not only available but forced upon everyone, is now leading to the closure of small businesses, and even, most incredibly of all, there was a group of nuns who barely escaped by the skin of their teeth being closed down because they would not take part in peddling contraceptives. What in the world have we come to? But moreover, speaking of contraceptives, it has been the consistent and unswerving teaching of the magisterium of the Church that will not change that contraception is something gravely opposed to the dignity of the human person in God's plan, and therefore constitutes grave and mortal sin. In other words, it's going to keep us out of heaven. And by another statistic, this one offered by the data of the Population Division in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs at the UN, 75% of sexually active Americans make use of contraception. But last of all, perhaps one of the things that we so pride ourselves on, which is technological advancement for the sake of the world, presumably expanding freedom, diminishing hunger, and all things of that sort, especially with the use of the information superhighway, the internet, which now makes us far more sophisticated and educated and progressed beyond previous generations. Do you know what the internet is primarily used for? That's right. 1/3 of all traffic on the internet is pornographic. 1/3. And to try and get some sense of that number, of the tens of millions of searches that are run each day through Google and other things, if we break it down by hours and minutes, that means that about 50,000 new searches are being launched every minute. We can't even conceive of how many have happened since we began Holy Mass. And all of that simply would be a gloss on what Our Lady said, that more souls are being lost to such things than anything else. And we're somehow complicit. Some form or fashion. There's many ways to be an accomplice to sin. By flattery, by condemnation, by not looking, by turning the other way, so on and so forth. And I suppose to conclude all of that, what do Americans do? By another piece of data provided by the U.S. Department of Education, Americans watch a cumulative total of nearly a decade of television and social media. So while the world is absolutely disintegrating in a form and fashion that has never been seen in perhaps all of human history, perhaps not even at the time of the flood, we're wasting away before our entertainment. So, I think that suffices. As painful as it is to say it all, of our very first point, the world is very sick, isn't it? Let's say it. The world is very sick. So here comes the silver lining. If there are 3 people that have managed to escape from something that previously had a 100% mortality rate, this brain-eating amoeba, If the Mother of God appears to humankind and says, this is what's going to happen if you don't pay attention, if you don't follow my peace plan, things are going to get a lot worse. In 99 years, they've gotten a lot worse. But the reason is because we didn't listen. We didn't actually follow the peace plan. The solution? Book the Mayo ticket. Get to the Mayo Clinic. Let's listen to our mama's recipe. And what was that? You might think that, oh my gosh, what is it going to be? What are we going to have to do? Are we going to have to walk the whole world barefoot? No. In fact, it was something far simpler, something within the reach of all of us. Basically 3 things. To pray the rosary every day, which was the theme of last week. To honor the first Saturdays of each month, which we can talk about on another occasion. And lastly, in everything that we do throughout our daily toils and struggles and sufferings, to offer all of that up for the reparation of the sins of the world and for poor sinners that have no one to pray for them. That was something that even little Jacinta and Francisco, 9 and 10 years old, probably soon to be canonized, something that even they could do, something that every Christian can do. In the history of salvation, God sometimes asks big things and sometimes he asks little things. But in every case, he always asks for fidelity to exactly what he says, because he knows what he's talking about. I'll cite one example. The great Moses, the heroic man who stared down Pharaoh, the so-called God of the world at the time, the Lord of Egypt, to lead his people out, who called down at God's command the plagues which smote him. And leading them out, Moses, the miracle worker, parted the Red Sea. He called down manna from heaven. Moses, the mediator, who went up on Mount Sinai and fasted for 40 days and 40 nights to spare the lives of the Israelites, who themselves were at that moment caught up in grave sin with the golden calf. Moses mediated and said, spare the lives of these people. Moses, the lawgiver, who brought down the stone tablets. And Moses, the saint, the one man who spoke to God face to face. Moses, the great patriarch, Moses, the great prophet, Moses, the great miracle worker. It was Moses who at the end of his life, in his exasperation, from his impatience, and ultimately from his exhaustion, forgot to heed exactly what our Lord said. Do you remember how that went down? That once again the Israelites were grumbling and saying, why did you lead us out into the desert to die? Why didn't you leave us in Egypt? And Moses cries out and he says, Lord, what am I going to do with these people? You've broken my back. I can't take it anymore. Please kill me yourself. But I can't bear it anymore. And God says to Moses, he says, I will hear their grumbling and I will provide them water. Strike the rock with your rod and water will flow out from them. Do you remember what poor Moses did in his great exhaustion and frustration with the people? He struck the rock twice. And what was the end result? Water flowed out. But God said to Moses, because you have broken faith with me, you cannot enter into the land which I have promised to this people. I will lead you up on a mountain, and you will behold that land from a distance. But you cannot cross over. There you will die. If that happened to one of the greatest men in the history of salvation, what does it say about paying attention to the details of what our Lord says? In the midst of a world that is so sick that we can scarcely conceive of it, the Mother of God, surely sent by God's command, has come down and says, my dear children, please do this. I love you dearly. And you are all heading for destruction. Do this. This is your mama's peace plan. I desire to protect you and to shelter you. Do this. Pray the rosary. Honor the first Saturdays. Offer up your sufferings for the sake of sinners. A simple plan, which 99 years on, apparently, we haven't gotten the memo yet. So in conclusion, That's exactly what we are trying to do now. Our own bishop yesterday at the Eucharistic Congress with 14,000 people reconsecrated our diocese, the Diocese of Charlotte, to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. What a beautiful and significant action that a successor of the apostles would, in response to these petitions of Fatima, consecrate our diocese. And so, trying to follow his lead, we're doing the same thing at our little parish. And so at World Feast, we're going to consecrate St. Thomas Aquinas to the Immaculate Heart, and in preparation for that, every Sunday leading up to that, at the prayers of the faithful, we're going to pray together the Litany of Loreto. So if you want a little something to remember, all of those awful things that I was forced to recite, let's call that the Litany de Malo, which means the Litany of Evil. And yet, that's not the last word. The counterstrike, let's call it the Litany of Loreto, which is what we're going to say. A petition to Our Lady that her Immaculate Heart would triumph over all of this evil and take her children safely home. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.